Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Teknokrat Lectures channel. I'm Ngestirosa and I'll be guiding you in English prose and literature class. There are three objectives that we are going to study in this topic. Yes, first, that I'd like to explain about definition of prose and literature. The next one, I'd like to mention characteristic of prose. That's the most important thing in this topic. And the next one is about intrinsic element. I will explain the whole intrinsic element that will be discussions in this subject. Well, before we dive in, better to discuss about the definition of prose. Yeah. Prose is a form of written language that follows the natural flows of speech and grammatical structure. Unlike poetry, which often relies on meter and rhyme, prose is more straightforward and conversational. That's the main point of prose. Prose is a part of literature. Literature is imaginative work consisting of poetry and prose, but we focus on more on prose discussions. And then I'd like to tell you about the characteristic of prose. Well, in prose, there are some natural flow. First, natural flow, Prose mimic everyday speech, making it straightforward and accessible. That's the characteristic of prose for number one. And the second one, sentence structure. Prose relies on sentence and paragraph rather than lines and stanza, which you can find in poetry. In poetry, you see there are some lines and stanza, but in prose, we have some sentences and paragraph. And the next one, narrative form. Prose commonly used in storytelling, essay, article, and novel. So in prose productions, we can find in novel, fiction, short story, and other form. And then in prose, as I told you before, it is different from the one in poetry. So lack of meter. Meter we can find in poetry. So prose does not follow a specific metrical structure that we can find in poetry. The next one. Well, so we go for number 5, the characteristic of prose. Number 5 is varied diction. In prose, the language can range from formal to informal, depending on the context and purpose. So if you see like the one in short story or novel or other kind of prose, the language is informal. There are some dialogue, narration, and dialogue among the characters, and then there are some narrations explaining about the setting, and then explaining about the characters, and also explaining about the plot. So it makes the informal one language in prose. Well, and the next one, number 6, focus on clarity. Prose aims for clear communication of ideas, often prioritizing content over form. So there are some ideas that is purpose to communicate. So there are some topic in prose that will be in the ideas of writing. So you can see the story that the story about heroes, the story about crime, the story about romance, and the story about horror or others. So the genre in prose that makes the clarity. So in prose, the language is really clear. So because it is used to communicate the ideas, and it emphasizes content. All right. So then the last one, as the characters of prose, is descriptive element. While it can be descriptive, prose usually emphasizing narrative and exposition over elaborative imaginary. So the imaginary language is the one that is applied in prose, even though in prose we can also find fiction and fictions, but focus more to imaginary. like the one in horror fiction or in crime fiction, yeah, the writer sometimes emphasizes more on how the language, using imaginary language, can be communicated to the audience. So it will focus more to descriptive language. So the writers will explain about the sad thing. Yeah, this is what I explained in crime fiction. So the writer needs to describe the sad thing of crime, need to discuss the doer of the crime, and need to describe the background of crime case. Yeah, so this is the most important thing in prose language, that the descriptive element will be used in a prose. And prose actually encompasses what range of written works, yeah, from fiction and non-fictions to academic texts and journalistic article. So kinds of prose can be, as I told you before, it is found in novels, short story, that you can see in many kinds of work. Yeah, the one that I love from prose is the story. When we talk about the story, we can find in fiction. Yeah, as I told you before, that in prose there are two kinds of work. The first one in fiction and non-fiction. Well, when we talk about fiction, fiction is something imaginary, and everything is from the writer's imagination. So the writer has imaginations to elaborate that story that is delivered to the reader. So the fiction stories are all made up. All the characters and places comes from the author's imaginations. If you see the story, yeah, the story will be more interesting, and then more what we call then, will have a kind of mass reader when the story has more imaginary. So in fiction, the writer can go along with his or her imaginations without any limit. They can elaborate their experience, they can elaborate the moment that they have, and they can elaborate many things that comes from their experience. So they can go to plot and characters from the things that they imagine. So this is the important thing that make the fiction will be more interesting. All right. So in fiction also called as a written works for entertaining reader. And there are many examples, as I told you before, in novel and short stories. Yeah, the novel maybe you can find in many kind of genre: crime fiction, horror fiction, detective fiction, romance fiction, gothic fiction, and also chick lit fiction. And those genre actually written by fictional writers that can be interpreted in various way by the audience. So the audience can grasp the writer's intentions in delivering the story. In fiction writing, no such references are required because the focus is story to entertain the audience on the reader. Well, as I told you, in prose it can be also non-fiction. Non-fiction is something that's true. In non-fiction writing, real people and real places are involved, such as history book and autobiography. Yeah, for the easiest one you can see in autobiography work, because this is and the things comes from real life and real people, real places. So the writer has to be straightforward. There is no scope for any imagination. It is actually reallocation of fact. So the writer will gather some fact that they experienced before, and they write it in the form of non-fiction. Yeah, you can see there are many autobiography that comes from the author experience and the author's real life. And then non-fiction writing are simple and direct. In non-fiction writing, you may need to give reference for your writing, including notes to the text. This is needed to make your writing more credible. Well, for the whole subject in this prose subject, yeah, actually I will discuss more on intrinsic element, but we like to discuss what is intrinsic element first. Well, actually, intrinsic element is a building block of literary works that come from the work itself. So in intrinsic element of prose, yeah, we can find 6 kinds that makes the story better. So in every fiction prose, you can find 6 intrinsic elements. The first is characters and characterization. The second one is setting, and the third one is theme, and the fourth one is plot, and the fifth one is point of view, and the last is style and tone. I will discuss the whole things of intrinsic element in our subject English prose. But first of all, I will explain this one by one in short. Okay. First one about characters and characterizations. Well, characters are persons that are represented by the author in the story. So in every prose, you will have characters. And then characters will be the main part of prose, of fiction writing. So the characters will be delivered by the authors to make the story live. No fiction without characters. And the characters will be characterized by the authors, and it is called characterization. So characterization is the representations of prose in narrative and dramatic work. So the authors will apply characterizations to the story. It can be from the dialogue or from the narrations in the work of prose. Well, the second one, intrinsic element, we will discuss about a setting. Yes, setting, it is also the most important part in prose fiction. Well, setting refers both to the physical location of the event and to the time in which they happen. For example, the setting in the garden, the setting in the house, and the setting of time, and then the setting of work. So setting, as I gave you an example before, setting is the environment that surrounds the characters and influence them and their action. Setting is the time and places in which the event, the story occur. Most stories have multiple settings which has been created by the authors to tell the story. So this make the setting is also the most important part in fiction writing. Well, number 3, plot. Plot is also the most important thing in prose fiction. And then plot is what arises the moment the characters, all characters are set into motion. And characters and the place of the chessboard and plots is the strategic moving of those pieces. So in plot, the characters will set into motion. And then they will start the story, and then plot will be divided into some event and then what we call a storyline. And then plot is very interesting because there can be many different plots going on the same time, each with different outcome. Plot make the dramatic or narrative work So it will focus to the structure of action. So the characters, yeah, will go to the action in plot part, yeah, and then it will come to the order, yeah, and then we will discuss more specific for our discussions for next meeting. All right, so we go for number 4, theme. Theme is the controlling idea or central insight of a piece of fiction. It is unifying generalization about life, stated or implied by the story or the fundamental dialogue of a story. Theme is the underlying meaning of the story, a universal truth. In theme, you can find many themes that make the story become interesting. So in theme, there is a kind of significant statement the story is making about, and then it will be about the society or nature or human condition. Yeah, theme sometimes is created by the authors firstly before or after they make a fiction writing. All right, so we can go for number 5, point of view. Point of view is defined as the angle from which the story is told. And then point of view is also important part in prose fiction. And then point of view is basically a question through whose eyes we see the fictional world and whose voice tell us the story. Sometimes the story is delivered in the first point of view by using I, and then the third point of view by using we, and then the third point of view by using someone's name. Okay, and the second point of view we use that one is you. And then the most part in prose fiction we use the third point of view that clarify the name of characters. Well, the next element in prose fiction, yeah, especially intrinsic element, the last one is style and tone. Style and tone also the crucial element of prose that shape how readers perceive a piece of writing. Style encompasses word choice, sentence structure, figurative language, voice, formality, and narrative pace. For instance, we can see Ernest Hemingway's style is known for its brevity and directness, while Scott Fitzgerald is rich and elaborate. And then that one is style. And tone, on the other hand, reflects the writer's attitude toward the subject or audience, conveying emotions like sarcasms, optimisms, naturality through word choice and sentence construction. And then together style and tone create a unique and engaging reading experience. That's why, as I told you, style and tone is also important in prose writing. Alright, I think that's all for the explanation of intrinsic element in prose fictions. I'd like to conclude. There are 6 intrinsic elements in prose. The first one is character, setting, theme, plot, point of view, and the last is style and tone. I think that will be all for our discussions today. See you again in the next discussions, and then we will discuss more on characters and characterization. Okay, thank you. Bye.